DPI have been acknowledged as an infrastructure solution that could foster sustainable growth and promote more inclusive and equitable access to digital services. This approach is already core to our company mission. PagoPA has been indeed established with the aim to build some of the major infrastructures that are nowadays enabling the digital transition of the Italian public sector. For instance, in the field of payments, interoperability, and most recently, on the digital identity. Precisely, in relation to this last point, we are satisfied with the synergy achieved in the framework of the European digital identity solution. As PagoPA, we are involved in the development of a digital wallet model, both on a national level and within the international large-scale pilots, together with the Italian Department of Digital Transformation and the partners like Trentino Innovation Hub Foundation, led by Mrs. Forno. Today's panel will surely make a further contribution to the evolution of the debate on VDPIs and as a new approach to digital transformation, which can accelerate and make sustainable the deployment of digital public services, focusing on protocols, standards, and open solutions. Thank you.
First of all, let me thank the organizers and PagoPA in particular for the opportunity given to Hub Innovazione Trentino to participate on behalf of Trentino Research and Innovation System in this very stimulating panel. The choice of proposing today a debate on DPI is very timely and stimulating in consideration of the large echo at national, European and global level of the issue. It is an instrumental body of the autonomous province of Trento. Specifically, it is a foundation whose founding members are, in addition to the province of Trento, the Keslen Foundation, the Mach Foundation, the University of Trento, and Trentino Sviluppo. Its main mission is to scout and promote initiatives, mainly in reach and innovation, involving different socio-economic players active in the region, and to foster strategic partnership at national and international level, keeping as reference the European policy priorities and the global trends. The strong partnership with PagoPA must be seen in this sense, based on a shared vision of adherence to the European model of digital society, anthropocentric and respectful of fundamental rights, and with the common awareness that relevant results can only be achieved with the utmost available professionalism. We believe that the digital identity, with its countless applications in perspective, represent one, if not the most important, of the enabling factors toward the true digital society, and one that main pillars necessary to guarantee a truly democratic across to the public and private services that will constitute the DPI ecosystem. In that respect, we remain committed to continue working together with our strategic partners, PagoPA. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opening remarks. We have heard them from Alessandro Moricca, who is the CEO of PagoPA, and Ivonne Forno, the president of the Hub Innovazione Trentino. I would now like to welcome all of you at the 24th edition of the State of the Union, organized by the European University Institute here in Florence. I'm Anna Pisarkiewicz, a research fellow at the Center for Digital Society at the EUI, and I have the pleasure today to introduce the panel on digital public infrastructure, DPI, for inclusion and digital innovation, and to moderate the panel with Clothilde Goujard, who has been covering tech policy at Politico for the past 3 years. Before delving into this topic, for those of you who cannot stop or resist from twittering, I would ask you to use the hashtag SOU2024. So very briefly, the term DPI has officially entered into the global policy vocabulary in 2023 when during its presidency of G20, India took the lead in advocating for DPI on the global platform, securing high-level commitments from over 100 countries. Also, there has been a unanimous support for the declaration from the New Delhi leaders, which certainly facilitated accelerated development of DPI globally. However, as the G7 entered into the discussion in Trento in March this year, it has become quite clear that we are just at the very beginning of this debate. The comparison of the G7 and G20 ministerial documents reveal that there are potentially some areas that can be disputed. First, there's the issue of scope and purpose. Should the focus of DPI be on improving the delivery of public services, or should it help restructure market and the delivery of private services? Or maybe both? When considering the motivation for implementing DPI, should competition be one of the fundamental issues on equal footing as social inclusion? And lastly, we must address the design principles such as security, IPR, interoperability, the use of open source technology, open standards, and so on, to create an ecosystem that benefits all. These are, of course, just some of the questions that we as a community have to answer, and certainly we will not be able to cover all of them today. But what do we actually mean by DPI? Clothilde.
So like Anna was saying, the definition for DPI actually happened very recently. At least G7 countries agreed to one just last year. They often refer to digital building blocks that allow governments to provide safe and inclusive services for citizens and businesses. And these can include anything from digital identity systems, electronic payment systems, and data exchange systems as well. Right here in Europe, for example, just this week, the European digital identity entered into force. This means that all EU citizens and residents should have an app with a digital ID wallet by 2026. This will allow users to identify themselves, to use this app on public but also private services like some major online platforms, sign digital documents, and so on. And so this brings me to the introduction of our first panelist, Paolo de Rosa. De Rosa works with the European Commission, where he's been leading the work on the deployment and the development as well of the European digital identity and the implementation of the regulation, eIDAS regulation.
Then we should also have online with us, but I cannot see him on the screen here, Felipe González-Zapata, who is digital government lead at the OECD, where among others he coordinates the Digital Government Index. Okay, we can see him now. And finally, we have here João Ricardo Vasconcelos, who is a senior governance specialist in the GovTech Global team of the Governance Global Practice at the World Bank. Thank you all for being here with us today, and I'll give the floor back to Clothilde for the first question. Or maybe just a second. Yeah. We will have a round of questions, and after that we will have time for questions from the audience, so just so you can start preparing your questions to our speakers. Clothilde.
I'll start with you, Paolo, and we'll start with a discussion on digital public infrastructure and rights. We just mentioned the new EU digital identity. And I'm wondering, how is the European Commission making sure to protect fundamental rights like privacy, data protection, while pushing for innovations with DPIs?
Thanks for the question indeed. So the digital identity is one of the DPI, one of the most important, I guess, because it's giving access. So the European Commission has established a comprehensive set of European digital rights and principles in the declaration in the Digital Decade program, and that are core values of the EU. And so every day, so this driving innovation and balancing and making sure that these values and principles are embedded in our policies, basically our job every day. So as this has been done in the regulation. So what we do is making sure that those values are, all the technology is, and the innovation is built around that. So the human centricity and inclusion, the privacy, and all the fundamental rights we do have. So, and in particular, in the ID, and with this amendment, this new regulation that is amending the previous one, we focused exactly to shift the paradigm into this direction, making the user is at the center of the the action of sharing data, making sure that it's in control of that data.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, so now I would have a question to you, Felipe. Could you tell us something about the impact of DPI on economic transformation within the OECD member countries, particularly with respect to digital and social inclusion?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. Apologies for not being able to make it in person. I hope you can hear me.
Yes?
Perfect. So, I'm really nice to see also good and old friends in the panel. True enough, as you mentioned, I think we observe closely the development of DPI across OECD members, and we see the extent to which they have the potential to create economic value for the wider society, economy, but also for government itself, and that's something that I covered sector. The European Commission itself has estimated that between 100 or 1,000 million euros could be created in the next few years just with the development of the digital identity wider across the Union, including thousands of jobs and also reduce risks and enhance access to secure the online services from both the private and the public sector. I think it's also interesting that in many European countries, the role of the digital identity has been also to provide access to private sector services. Like, for example, in Estonia, where more than 80% of the usage of digital identity is precisely to have access to the financial services. So it's true enough that I think there are multiple possible areas that digital identity could create economic value. Also, the colleagues mentioned the role of data exchange. It's through the work that the OECD is doing in supporting enhanced access and sharing of data. We do see that if data is shared also within governments and beyond, there's a potential of between up to 1% of the GDP growth just for promoting the exchange of data across the economy and society.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. João, I turn to you now. One thing that's really important in DPIs is multi-stakeholders, consultation, partnerships. You do this with the World Bank, so I want to hear a bit more about your experience in the implementation and design. Can you tell us a bit more about the best practices to foster effective partnerships between government, private sectors, companies, civil society, and international organizations?
Okay, absolutely. And first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. My first statement would be that when you think about digital government, when you think about GovTech, or when you think about digital public infrastructure, it's really beyond, it's something beyond the public sector on itself, meaning you have expertise in the public sector, and that's super appreciated for that. But in order to properly enhance, to navigate this area, you need to go beyond the government, and you need to bring on board the private sector, the academia, the civil society. Because mostly in this areas of digital and of technology, with the fast pace of innovation that is happening, you need this kind of synergies, not only in terms of knowledge, because we know that the knowledge is beyond government, but you need also partnerships and multi-stakeholder partnerships to make sure that there is joint efforts, joint ownership, and joint responsibility when you develop this kind of initiatives. And that's also the case of digital public infrastructure. In the case of the World Bank, because we like to do what we preach, we established our GovTech Global Partnership. That is a partnership that brings right now together around 70 partners. I can see several of them here, the OECD, the European Commission, but also governments everywhere. Also the Italian government is with us, and that's exactly the rationale, to make bridges in terms of knowledge exchange in this area, and we do it when we exchange knowledge, when there is convening activities in this area. We also observe that in the countries that are advancing and committed in this area, when you try to develop policies on digital, namely on digital public infrastructure, you need to bring this ecosystem on board. And I could quote different examples. I could go from the example of Brazil. I could quote the examples of Slovenia, where when governments embrace the development, for instance, of a strategy in this area, they were able not only to bring together the different sectors of government for it, but also making sure, again, that the academia, that the private sector, then the civil society was on board. So that's also how we apply this kind of digital public infrastructure thinking. So thinking on bringing everybody on board.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So I would now like to turn again to Paolo. DPIs are going to be one of the main tools in the pursuit of social inclusion. However, given that there will be plenty of DPIs, interoperability emerges as one of the main issues. Could you discuss the main obstacles to ensuring interoperability within the EU's digital public infrastructure, particularly regarding the EID frameworks, and what implications do these challenges have for ensuring digital inclusion across member states?
Thanks for the question. It's a very good question. So indeed, one of the reasons why we started also to evaluate make an assessment of the current EIDA system is because it has worked for the trust services, so that has been very well established, while for the digital identity there are still a lot of problems of interoperability, even if there are mechanisms that support this. But the main problems that we analyzed are obviously technical diversity, because every member state was obviously implementing this in a very different way, even if they can talk each other through a node, an EIDAS node, but the diversity between each member state is creating a kind of silos that is not allowing a kind of a level playing field for all the players, not only the public one, but also the private one. The second point is obviously the legal and the regulatory differences. So each member state then are free to regulate, there is the regulation that is established a common ground, but then there are details that can be defined around the identity, digital identity, that might be an obstacle. It depends how this is. So the mantra of the new regulation is exactly harmonization. That's why we are spending a lot of time. Then even if when you have a very, as I said, detailed plan, technical standards, there are problems in the implementation, because then the implementation requires testing and proving. So the infrastructure needs to be tested across member states and across different sectors in order to be ready. And finally, and the most important, I guess, is the trust and acceptance from the user. That leads to the inclusion, because if there is no trust by the user, if there are no trust by the player or the government, then the whole infrastructure, even if it's very solid in terms of technical terms, is going to be completely useful. We do have many examples in the past of very well done infrastructure, common infrastructure, public infrastructure that have not been then used by the user because it was missing the trust. And the trust is something that you need to build around what you develop. So these are the main at least issue we have analyzed.
Thank you so much.
Now to you, Felipe. We'd like to speak a bit more about data sharing frameworks. How important is it for international cooperation? How important is it to set up frameworks for government-to-government data sharing?
I would say that it's critical and it's essential. And true enough, the sharing of data between governments requires a lot of dialogue and consensus between like-minded countries, as we've seen that, for example, the European Union has advanced with the Data Governance Act and with the current work of for the digital identity wallet as well. I think it's in the context of data sharing between governments, it's important to acknowledge the role that a common approach to data governance means. That's why, for example, the Act, the European Act on Data Governance, try to achieve. In particular, so when data is exchanged, it's done under the common common standards beyond the technical implementation. And we've seen many solutions within Europe that try to support the data exchange within governments. I think it's important to think of common standards and approaches that would enable that data sharing across between countries as well. And I think there is also an angle here about innovation, like balancing the opportunities and risks. And I think that that's precisely one of the key roles that some DPI can have. I think, for example, empowering users to better understand how their data is used, how their data is shared, for example, through digital identity systems will be essential to give consent, to withdraw consent, to monitor uses. And I would say that from the work that the OECD does, this is at the core of some recent developments, such as the OECD recommendation on the governance of digital identity, which try to bring together member countries, including the European Union, to have a common approach to for mutual recognition and portable digital identities. So this data sharing and ownership over how data is shared, it can happen not just within at regional level, but also among regions as well. And the case of, for example, the recent agreement between the European Union and Japan in order to mutually recognize their digital identity solutions is one step in this direction.
Thanks.
And now back to you, João. You have mentioned, you have spoken earlier about the importance of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And certainly the government is playing a pivotal role in that. So could you describe what is precisely the role of the government in ensuring digital public infrastructure are effective? What should the government do in terms of policy making, regulation, and ensuring equitable access? What specific strategies and policies should governments adopt to lead and support the development of robust, inclusive, and secure digital public infrastructure, ensuring that there is not too much regulation that can be implemented and enforced easily? Because I think this is one of the issues that have emerged in some other sessions during the State of the Union.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Very good question. Also, statement from our side, and we always repeat this, that is, digital government or GovTech or digital public infrastructure, it's not really about technology itself, okay? Because when you think and when you try to develop policies on across the world in different governments at national and subnational levels of government, it's not really the bits and bytes that create big discussion and that create big problems between the different public sector organizations. It's mostly the governance of the policy. That's really the key issue here, and that's something that governments, whether they are more advanced or less advanced in terms of digital development, they all face this. So how to overcome siloed approaches when developing, for instance, interoperability, or even a digital identity mechanism, like it was mentioned by Paolo, and Felipe also mentioned this. And for doing this, what you need, it's mostly a kind of governance approach when developing this policy. And I can give you several examples on this. You need absolute, you need vision, you need a strategy on how to do it. You need leadership in the public sector, making sure that there is at least an entity that is responsible for leading this agenda. You need to have the proper coordination to making sure that, as I mentioned previously, the different stakeholders are on board, they feel ownership, they feel responsibility for these policies. And you need also to go beyond, let's say, the strategic thinking of it, and think and focus on coherent implementation across the government. So we use the expression of having the right policy levers in place, meaning Issues like making sure that there is coherent procurement, that there is cross-cutting pre-evaluation of ICT expenses in the public sector, that there are common standards that are applied are super relevant. Let me underline, and of course, legal and regulatory frameworks, digital skills in the public sector, and this culture is fundamental. Let me just highlight, and that I think reflects a lot this thinking. When we have an interoperability working group in the World Bank that brings together around 40 partners, mostly governments in this area, and when we discuss with the different members what was the key issue, the key problem, what keeps them awake at night, the majority pointed to what they call the non-digital interoperability. Meaning, non-digital, it's about the coordination between government sectors. It's about developing shared services. So that's really the big challenge that governments face. And of course, there's no silver bullet for doing it, but I'm happy to further explore this domain.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yep.
We're going to enter our last round of questions, so we'll soon open up the floor for questions. So if you have any, you can prepare them. João, Paolo, looking forward, what are the key developments we can expect for the EU's digital ID? What are the next milestones?
So I think the key development, or having the wallet that is a very simple tool at the end, is not rocket science. And I believe the innovative part is that we are shaping, in this case, the technology around the way the use we want, the way we want to use the technology. In this case, the wallet is very simple. It's shifting completely the paradigm. It's something it's very familiar to us. Like getting a certificate, get some information that it's qualified, put into the wallet, and then showing every time that is needed to online services to prove some information. This paradigm is very familiar to every user. It's secure, oriented to the user, and is moving the data and the control to the user, and this in a very privacy and secure way. And so what we should expect is to start, as this is a framework, it's not just only for identification or authentication, but it's also trying to open opportunities to transform many aspects of our life in private and public sector in this direction. I think many things that could be related to accessing online services from the government, but also payments. As I said before, payments together with identity are very important because they are a rail for digital transformation. And this is a very good example is India, that's also give the name to the DPI, because in there, there's a very good example, even if it's not necessarily reflecting the same way that we're doing it in Europe, but they have been able to reach 700 of millions of users in their Aadhaar and UPI system. And so this which we should expect is have a tool that is going to be, first of all, voluntary. Nobody needs to accept by default. It's totally voluntary, and it's going to be available to everybody and anyway supported by all the services that needs public service and the private service should provide access to the citizen. So I believe this might influence in the same way that the GDPR influenced the old world, also in changing the way to access and share data.
Thanks.
Thank you. So Paolo has just mentioned that India has a very good example of DPI, and in fact, India has promoted this concept at G20 and is one of the leaders in DPI. Felipe, based on the OECD analysis, could you tell us what are some of the best practices in DPI from around the world that could serve as benchmarks for European countries?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's just to kick off this particular question, the answer to this particular question, I think it's also important to acknowledge that while the concept of DPI is new, I think many countries have been working on developing digital public infrastructure for many years already. And I think the case of Europe is quite interesting. So just to give you a couple of examples, in Norway, the approach to develop joint solutions, it's quite joint digital solution is quite prominent. Denmark is a really good example with the base registry, digital identity, digital pos, and other digital solutions that are shared and available to all institutions that they need. Estonia with X-Road and many others. So Italy is also, now that we are talking about the G7 presidency, PagoPA, speed, and now the rolling implementation of IT wallets and many others. So from outside Europe, I think we agree that India it's a really good example, and they have also managed to develop quite solid and robust systems. I think we see also in terms of other large economies, for example, the case of Brazil, that has developed the digital identity system, which is GoPR. Also considering the particular administrative context of Brazil, which is also a federal country, and we see that particularly in some federal countries in Europe, there are challenges to deploy this sort of more like centralized, portable, integrated sort of solutions. Also, Brazil has implemented a payment system which is called PIX that is also applied also at federal level and also reaching to local governments as well. Korea is a really good example about well-advanced data sharing system within the government, but also with other sectors as well. To name also the case of the UK, where the government as a platform approach is quite prominent and has been also developed for many years with the payment notification system and now the ongoing implementation of digital identity as well. So I think there are many examples outside Europe that can be also of interest, in particular because we see closely that some developing countries have been able to leapfrog the challenges of the legacy technology, and they have been able also to have the capacity to leverage in a faster way these new shared common solutions.
Thank you.
Thanks. And now our last question for you, João. Let's talk about emerging economies. Mm-hmm. What's been your experience in that field with these countries, and what are some critical considerations when implementing DPI in these places?
Absolutely. So on this, let me underline that one of the critical issues that we face is making sure that when you develop, namely digital public infrastructure, you are problem-driven and you are not technology-driven. Let me try to explain this. We know that with the fast pace of technology development, several times governments commit the mistake of being so enthusiastic on developing a specific technology. Let's think about AI. We need to have something on AI, or we need to have something that is based on data analytics, or we need something in terms of blockchain. What they certainly forget is to focus on the problem, on what they are trying to solve. Because several times, and we know, I think, as working in this area, this is common census, several times, it's not about the level of development of the technology that you're trying to employ. It's really on trying to make sure that the solution that you are delivering is solving a concrete problem from people, from persons, and that's super important. The role of the World Bank convening the global north and the global south is fundamental on this. Like it was mentioned by Felipe, making sure that some countries can leapfrog in terms of development of digital government policies. It's fundamental. Learning from what works, but also from what doesn't work. And we have different experience that work through working groups, through peer-to-peer learning that we promote, where we are able to make sure that, again, countries that are more ahead in their digital journey, they share not only their successes, but also what went wrong when developing a specific domain. And this is key, making sure that you do that. Of course, when you convene different experiences, you need to make sure and be conscious that what works in Korea eventually will not work in Panama. I'm just giving this example, or what works in Brazil might not work in Mozambique. Just giving an example. Still, when you promote knowledge sharing, when you promote this kind of candid peer-to-peer learning, you are hopefully you avoid reinventing wheels, and you can build on the shoulders of the experience of countries that are already implementing this area. And for us, this is one of the biggest assets when we develop this kind of partnerships.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank all the speakers for being really excellent in respecting the time limit that we have given them. And I'm sure Clothilde and myself, we have plenty of questions, but I would like to open the floor to the audience and collect a first series of questions, let's say like 3, yeah, okay, so I can already see 2 questions. And please introduce yourself first and then before the question.
Okay,
Thank you.
Jeremiah Nyambinya is my name, Policy Leader Fellow at the European University Institute at the Florence School of International Governance. My question is there any international policy blind spot in relation to digital public infrastructure? And if there is, what do you believe should be done to mitigate any risks that could emerge from those blind spots?
And then there was another question there.
Thank you. My name is Ivonne Forno. I'm a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute. Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. When we are talking about digital public infrastructure, it's mostly about public sector and public services, but my question is about services such as financial services that are sometimes usually provided by non-public entities and other types of services. And so what is your vision and maybe any plans for the role of non-governmental, non-public actors? Thank you.
Okay, maybe then we can have a first round of responses from our speakers. You would like to start?
Yeah, sorry, can I ask you where the first question, because maybe I can start for the last one, but
of course.
So when we talk about digital public infrastructure, I do believe we start, as João was pointing out before, we need to start thinking in a way that is not only the public sector doing that. So any actor playing for example, in digital identity, I can speak better than that, is part of the infrastructure. It's a public-private partnership, and that because there are rules also for the privates, and we are part of an ecosystem. So when we talk about digital public infrastructure, I think it's not public in the sense it's just the public sector. It's just it's used by the public overall. So I think there should be ways to establish this in a very well-defined way, because it was just already pointed. So can I ask again? Sorry, the first question.
Is there any international policy blind spot in relation to digital public infrastructure? And if there is, what are the mitigating, you'd say, solutions to any risks that could emerge?
I'm pretty sure there are blind spots, and it's not really my area, so I would briefly say, so if, for example, for the digital identity, for sure, there are, and the way we want to cope for now, the experience is that we cope that bilaterally first, and then try to find a common ground that could be extended. But maybe I'll leave this to you or Felipe that are much experienced in this area.
Okay. Yeah, on the part of the blind spots, for sure, several, depending on the countries. Based on my experience, probably one of the biggest is related with securing the take-up on the use of digital public infrastructure. Let's think about digital identity. Let's think about digital payments. Let's think about data sharing or interoperability in the public sector. It's super frequent, let's say. It's probably the most typical mistake that we see in governments to deliver the infrastructure, to deliver the platform, to deliver, meaning the technical part, making sure that everything is ready. But then the take-up doesn't really happen. So nobody or few citizens or few public bodies end up using it. And of course, there's not an explanation for that, and it depends really on country to country. But I would say that, coming back to the part of the coordination, of the partnerships, that's why you need, from scratch, from design, make sure that when you're trying to implement a digital public infrastructure, you make sure that you bring the right stakeholders on board and make sure that it's a joint commitment. It's not only about making available an interoperability hub, for instance, or even a digital identity piece. It's making sure that it's useful and that it was developed and designed, making sure, securing that everybody is interested on it and will use it. So that's probably one of the main points that I would say. On the part of the non-public, the engagement of the non-public entities, like it was mentioned, I think Paolo already underlined it a lot. But even taking the example of digital identity, we can point to examples worldwide where governments developed public digital identity systems, and it went well. Okay, so they developed from scratch digital public identity systems like citizen cards or others, and it went well. And also other situations where it didn't went that well. Again, the take-up was a big issue. And we have other examples of countries. I always quote the example of Norway, for instance, that instead of developing a public digital identity system from scratch, the government built on the digital identity systems that were already underway by the banking system, for instance. And this secured from scratch a take-up that was huge. So because people were already used to use the digital identity to interact with their bank, they started doing this to interact with government services. So it went well. Again, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but for sure, if you are designing policies for your country or for subnational government in this area, make sure that you know different examples and then try to apply, building on that, on those experiences. Yeah, I don't know, Felipe.
Yes, thank you, João. I agree with the answer from my fellow panelists, and maybe starting with the second point about who are the actors around the table. I do agree. I tend to agree that I think the important factor here is to think about an ecosystem that collaborates and works together in order to, based on the domestic reality, develop the best approach for DPI at national level, in close coordination, in close observance and dialogue with other international actors, so to make sure that any development in the future can interoperate with other solutions and jurisdictions as well. And I think there are many countries, the colleagues already mentioned some. There are DPI solutions within the EU that are provided by the private sector. Italy is one example. There are also other countries where the ownership over the DPI is purely within the public sector, and also even the context of the country, like Luxembourg. There are centralized teams that basically develop all the solutions for public sector entities, considering the domestic reality in terms of population and administrative complexity. So I think there are many factors. The important thing is to make sure that the right people, the right ecosystem is in place. And rather than thinking who owns the solution, I think it's important to think how can be used and who will be using it. And I think in the case of as I think it was mentioned at the beginning, the role or the priority of the G7 and the G20, I think it's this year's focus of the G7 is really to look into the application of DPI within the public sector, acknowledging the role that DPI can have in the broader economy, as Italy itself, with a G20 member as well, endorsed in the declaration that India last year. On the first point, briefly, I think that there are many blind spots from internally or in terms of securing the right financial resources and investment mechanisms, so to make sure that DPI don't become a legacy technology in the future, for example, which is also a big challenge in some more advanced countries. I think there are two important factors. I think one is really to make sure that users are empowered to oversee how DPI is used. I would like to underline again that factor and the role that DPI itself can have. So digital identity can be an excellent mechanism to secure that, to empower, to provide agency over the use of DPI. And also to mention that there are efforts at the international fora. I mentioned briefly the work that we've been doing with the OECD, but also closely working with the European Commission for the recommendation on the governance of digital identity. Currently, the UN Tech Envoy has launched this DPI safeguards, that it's an ongoing effort to collectively think across regions on what are the best ways to make sure that DPI is inclusive, it's respect individual rights. So I acknowledging that there are many blind spots, also to say that there are also ongoing efforts that are looking into this issue and to make sure that there is a common approach to address some of them.
Yes, another question. Thank you, Felipe.
Good afternoon, Nadia Kowalczykowa from the EU Institute for Security Studies. My question is on societal resilience. Digital infrastructure is indeed impacting the lives of all of us. We are using it on a daily basis, so it's a critical infrastructure. And we are now, of course, thinking how to ensure that we enhance the resilience of the society towards any exploitation of vulnerabilities of the digital infrastructure that could be exploited by hostile actors or anyone that wants to disrupt the functioning of this critical infrastructure. So how do you think we can enhance the societal resilience against such abuse or exploitation of the vulnerabilities of the digital infrastructure?
Before we answer, is there any other question from the audience at the moment? No. No. Clothilde, you had some question you wanted to raise or no?
I guess I would have a lot of follow-up questions, but I'm also interested in hearing a bit more. I cover on a daily basis cybersecurity and privacy, and I'm just wondering, we're seeing a steady rise in cyber attacks, and I guess with like if you make everything digital, what are the risks that such data could, with one breach, could end up in the wrong hands? So I think I'd be interested in hearing what you think. And going back to the question of trust, what can be done, or what are you doing with the Commission or at the World Bank to increase that trust and acceptance in this context of, I think, more cybersecurity fears surrounding privacy and potential bad actors?
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, Anne-Marie Slaughter, CEO of New America. So I'd be fascinated if you've looked at all to any states of the United States. There's no chance that it's our federal government. We're all for digital private infrastructure, but maybe California, maybe other states.
Thank you so much. We have plenty of questions, so who would like to go first this time?
I can go first. Maybe on the first question, I tried to summarize what you asked, and I believe I can stay here hours. I cannot, but in particular in resilience, because it's a very good topic. It obviously depends what we are talking about. In the digital identity field, is something we have been thinking a lot together, also member state experts, academia, and all the civil society. There are a lot of discussion about resilience. But one of the concepts that we introduced, for example, in the current regulation is decentralization. So increasing the number of, reducing a single place that can be attacked and everything can be taken. And so also empowering the user and making it transparency to increase the trust is one of the other elements. So I think it cannot be answered in a single way. So when we need to talk to the specific kind of infrastructure, because all infrastructure have different scope, different architecture, and different things. But resilience is for sure one of the most important aspects that we care. because living in a digital society is obviously, we are moving everything in the digital world, and this needs to be secure, and through security is exactly the resilience. So it's specifically talking about the wallet. The idea is to decentralize the information and give the user the power to share them. So you will not have only one place where all this information are collected, but they are distributed to the user, and the user is the only one. I mean, if you break one, for example, wallet, your impact is only on one person, not all the population, for example. And well, there are other aspects. No, just to give an example, this is exactly what we thinking around the digital identity to make sure that it's going to be resilient and not being a blocking factor. On the trust, I think the trust I believe it's more complicated than the resilience, because maybe it can be fixed on a technical level, while the trust is going to a people level. So it's going to the, and this, for trust, I believe, it's very important how member state will take care of for example, the digital identity, or in general, the digital public infrastructure, giving transparency and empowering the user in order to the user be part of this infrastructure. I mean, how to use this infrastructure and inclusion. So normally, in technical world, we define trust how that property that is. You trust something when you know how will behave. You know exactly how will behave. So I don't want to have surprise. I need to rely strongly on this public infrastructure. So if we are able to give that, then people will trust and will use the infrastructure.
Okay. Maybe I can also take on this, and I think it more or less the ideas that Paolo shared here. On the one hand, from more technical perspective, yeah, you need to secure security by design on everything that is done nowadays, namely in terms of technology. So it's quite clear that it needs to be done like this, and mechanisms like, for instance, securing or making sure that you have redundancy on databases, on different systems. Digital can allow that, and sometimes makes it even more safe to use than analog systems. So please have it in mind. For the question of trust, it's always the balance and making the right bridge between, the one hand, questions of securing transparency on how data is being managed, making sure that citizens are aware of how this is being developed and is being taken care by the government, and at the same time securing also ownership of data. For instance, so myself as a citizen, I know that public administration is managing my data, but again, it's my data, and I should be able to know what the administration is doing with it. In fact, the case of the European Commission is always a good example through questions like the DGPR, and is used as a reference all over the world. So it's mostly this balance that needs to be secured, I think. On the question of California, I missed. I missed a little bit. Can you please clarify? Sorry.
If you look to it as an example in any way, there was a whole discussion of other countries that provide good examples of how to build digital public infrastructure, and I just wondered if there might be a U.S. example.
I don't. At least in terms of the bank and the part that we are working. The U.S. it's a quite complex reality to be managed. So we don't have, or I don't have exactly big comments or details to provide around that. But I'm more than happy to then come back to you on this issue.
Maybe I can start from the last question. I think one of the complexities also of the U.S. is sometimes the federal system. But we are working closely with the US also as part of the work with the G7 and the G20, and there are also good standards that the US have put in place in order, for example, to secure that if at central or federal levels, digital identity solutions, for example, are interoperable and mutually recognized. And I think that's the case with the NIST, the National Institute of Technologies, and I think the standard they have put in place, actually we follow it quite closely in order to support Italy in the mapping of digital identity solutions, which is something that we hope that we will share openly in the next few months as part of the support to the G7. And on the point of the role of DPI as critical infrastructure, I couldn't agree more. I think that's one of the most sensitive aspects. I think here is where I think the public sector has a more prominent role, not necessarily developing DPI, but making sure that within the ecosystem of solutions they are managed correctly and there are the right systems and mechanisms in place to monitor and the risks around digital public infrastructure and to mitigate them in the best possible way. And from a digital government perspective, those are capacities that I think there is room for improvement across globally, but in particular also in Europe. And that would make also, I think, will build the capacities to make sure that DPI can be managed in a safe way. Like I think I really like the approach that comparing DPI as public roads and public infrastructure like highways. And it's true that in some countries this can be developed by the public or the private sector, but the right monitoring systems and checks are, I think, it's also one of the roles of the public sectors.
Thank you so much, Felipe. We have 5 minutes left, so I would have one final question to each of you, but first I would like to make this observation. When I think about telecoms, what comes to my mind is that when you deploy an infrastructure, you look at this from the supply side, demand side, then you think about the deployment and take-up. That makes me think about what are we missing from the public side, from the private side, both in terms of supply and demand, and skills, digital skills, financial skills seem to me to be one of the issues, and trust, but trust in whom? So many of you have mentioned that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for everyone, that some countries can leapfrog. Many of the examples you have referred to, like Norway, Denmark, Estonia, are highly digitalized countries. So in the last minute each of you has, I would like you to tell us what are the 3 core ingredients for developing DPI in your view, because you have mentioned so many of them, but 3 building blocks, and I would like to see whether you all agree what these 3 essential ingredients are.
Okay, very tough question. So I'm thinking of, for sure, I would start from the design of the solution, that it has to be designed around the user, so it really depends how you design the technology and how you think the technology is going to be used. That's the first core principle and starting point. Then I would say security and privacy are the other 2, that they go together, because you need to have a risk assessment of all the issue that might arrive from these 2 points. And the third one is, I would say interoperability, yes, but it's a very technical point. I would say, again, trust for the adoption, okay? So if you design properly, if it's secure and privacy preserving, people will trust that solution and they will start adoption. And you need to keep that trust in the communication. So also communicating properly to the user how this is used, making trust not only on the solution, the digital public infrastructure, but also to who is managing that infrastructure is really important.
Thank you. Felipe.
Thank you. I think I agree with Paolo. I think my first ingredient would be to design, to develop and deploy DPI based on the needs of users, but also let's not forget service providers, who are a key actor in this equation as well. So users, when they obviously have access to their digital identities, but also service providers that make use of that solution to provide access to their services. I think that's one key factor. The second one, in my opinion, is to have the right governance mechanisms. So we talk a lot about the role of ecosystems and, for example, the importance of securing to managing risks and to secure resiliency. I think that can be achieved through having the right institutional arrangements, policies at national level, and also trying to look at international level. And here comes my third ingredient, which is to keep fostering and promoting international dialogue and cooperation. First, to learn from each other, as João mentioned, to learn what works, what it doesn't work, but also to interoperate, which I think is one of the key ambitions also of DPI, to make sure that the benefits of DPI don't remain only within at the domestic national level, but that they can also enable cross-border, cross-regional, international benefits to all as well.
Okay, yeah, and I was thinking about it. First, make it, as I mentioned, problem-driven. So make sure that you are really trying to solve something when developing a digital public infrastructure. It can be, and you can start doing a small service that demonstrates the value of this instrument that you are using, and then scaling up. So that's one. The second one is digital public infrastructure also allows governments to start by doing the basics right. Okay, so we've seen several times that with governments that are eager to leapfrog in some domains, they end up not having the right key building blocks underway, like digital identity, like data exchange in the public sector, like the right standards. So I think this call for digital public infrastructure that we are seeing nowadays, it's really a call for doing the basics right, and the basics right in terms of digital government. Last but not least, always make sure that the citizens' rights are being secured on this. It's impossible to think in a world like today where you don't assume citizens' digital rights as actually fundamental rights in our economies and in our societies. So that's also our role here as international organizations, as multilateral organizations, to make sure that this dimension is guaranteed. Okay.
I add one extra one?
10 seconds.
10 seconds. We should not forget sustainability, because everything that doesn't come for free. So, and it's not just free in terms of economy, but it has to cover cost and sustainability of governments and private sector. Otherwise, it's going to fail too. So that's
absolutely true.
Learn lesson.
The dialogue will continue. Thank you so much to all the speakers and to Clothilde. And I invite you to the final, I believe, session of the SOU after that one. And I wish you all a very nice afternoon and the weekend. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for being with us in the last panel of the day. So very challenging because we're in Florence and the sun is shining. And if you come from a place like where I live in Brussels, where we only had 3 minutes of sunshine between January and May, it's very tempting to want to go outside. So well done. Thank you so much for being here. And hopefully you can also engage with us. We'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. And hopefully you leave for the weekend with something that you learned today in this panel. I'm Javier Espinoza. I'm EU correspondent with the Financial Times, and I cover anything and everything that's to do with digital policy. And obviously this is a very relevant subject. I want to start, before we open up the discussion with the whole panel, with Stu Alderoty, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, Chief Legal Officer at Ripple. Tell us a little bit what your role means exactly and how you're dealing with this world of blockchain. Take us through gradually, where are we in this journey of blockchain as a technology evolving, and where we are where it comes to the tension between innovation and regulation before we flesh the subject out.
So Ripple is a 12-year-old advanced stage startup that was now a little over 900 employees. Our focus is to marry the promise of blockchain and traditional finance, focusing principally on facilitating cross-border payments and removing the friction of cross-border payments. Again, we're about 980 employees now. It started with 3 founders in 2012. As Chief Legal Officer, I manage all things legal, policy, and compliance. In the US, where we were founded, but I think we think of ourselves as a global company now. We have offices not only in San Francisco, New York, Miami, but in the UK, in Singapore, in Dubai, in Ireland, and a number of other countries. I don't want to offend anybody if I didn't name a Ripple office. But a lot of my focus and attention has been, over the past few years, is not only working with our policy team to build out, in cooperation with regulators, rational regulatory frameworks outside of the US, but dealing with the US's approach to this industry, which unfortunately has lagged behind what the rest of the world has been doing. In the US, it's somewhat difficult when it comes to financial regulation because we don't have a central principal financial regulator that covers all things finance. We've got multitudes of regulators. Each has jurisdiction over a different area of the financial structure. And where we've lost our way, I think, in the US over the past 4 or 5 or 5.5 or 6 years is the conversation has been about which of those regulatory agencies has the power and control over the technology rather than what is the right policy outcome. How do we create a framework that protects consumers, protects the integrity of the market, and does its best to keep bad actors out while facilitating an environment where the innovation can grow? The Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, it sort of self-proclaimed or self-anointed itself as the, quote, cop on the beat, close quote, of crypto. But to do that, the Securities and Exchange Commission has to establish that crypto assets, or those who are trading in crypto assets, are trading in a security. Because if they're not trading in a security, the Securities and Exchange Commission has no authority. So we've spent a lot of time in the US arguing, fighting in courts, litigating over what is or what is not a security. Ripple was sued by the SEC 3.5 years ago in December of 2020. No allegations of fraud, no allegations of market manipulation, no allegations of consumer harm, but strictly on this question as to whether the digital asset that we use in our tech stack, XRP, should be regulated and registered with the SEC as a security or not. We were the first major crypto player to be sued by the SEC in 2020. Sitting here today, I think every major player in the US has been sued by the SEC. In July of last year, July of 2023, we got a very good ruling from a federal judge in New York that established that a digital asset in and of itself is not a security, just like a bar of gold is not a security. But you can take a digital asset or you can take a bar of gold and you can wrap it in other promises, contracts, obligations, and it's that full bundle of promises and obligations and contractual rights that is the security. So for example, if you think of a share of stock, if I have a share of stock of Apple, if I own that share of stock, but then I were to pass it to anybody else on this panel, that share of stock, no matter who owns it or how it was traded, will always represent a right, title, and interest in Apple. And Apple, as a matter of corporate governance, will owe that holder of stock obligations to the shareholder. The digital asset doesn't work that way. Again, I can take a Bitcoin, I can take Ethereum, I could take XRP, I could take Solana, you can name any token, and we could trade it. Rights and obligations do not travel with that. It's simply a virtual currency or it's a commodity. If I wrap it with other promises and obligations, it's that full wrapper that becomes the security. So what the judge found in our case, again, very important, is the digital asset itself is not a security. She found that the programmatic trading of that digital asset on a centralized exchange, like a Coinbase, for example, that's not a security transaction, because you're simply taking a digital asset, you're offering it for sale, a buyer is interested in buying that asset, and the centralized exchange matches a willing seller to a willing buyer at an agreed upon price. But the seller doesn't know who the buyer is, the buyer doesn't know who the seller is, and you're simply selling the asset with no obligation, no promise. There's no right, title, or interest if you buy XRP from Ripple to come back to Ripple and say you owe me some contractual obligation or duty. Very, very important ruling that flows from the first finding that the digital asset in and of itself is not a security, the second finding that the trading of the digital asset on a spot trading market doesn't create a securities transaction. The judge did find that to the extent you sell the digital asset in a package of other obligations, in a package of other contractual promises, that wrapper, that is a security transaction. And in the past, Ripple had some institutional sales of the digital asset XRP that we use in our tech stack that were subject to contracts where Ripple owed the buyer obligations and the buyer owed Ripple obligations. He said, you know what, that was that is a security transaction which should have been registered. So she provided a lot of clarity to the industry. And now we see a multitude of these lawsuits out there against, I think, every major player in the US. But, and I think this is important to the second part of your question, this is not the way that new technology should be regulated. We can't regulate new technology through regulation by enforcement. Enforcement suggests that we know the rules by which market players should be complying with. But if you don't have clear rules, you shouldn't be bringing the enforcement actions. The first step is let's develop the clear rules. And then if those clear rules are violated, then you can bring the enforcement action. Unfortunately, in the US, we have flipped it. But I do think we've reached an inflection point in the US. I do think policymakers have woken up to the fact that this is a broken system. Regulation consistently applied should lead to predictable results. And we're leading, the regulation by enforcement strategy is leading to very unpredictable results. It's forcing the innovation, it's forcing the technology offshore. And they're starting to embrace and play catch up to the rest of the world that we need a comprehensive crypto market structure rulebook, legislation, and we're starting to see that actually now making its way through Congress with bipartisan support, and I think that's going to be the future, not this regulation by enforcement strategy that was started by the SEC, and I think the SEC, with each passing day, is becoming more isolated, and the policy makers are recognizing that we need a more rational, comprehensive policy approach.
Yet the SEC has a lot of power. Tell us a bit about what is the ingrained fear that is leading to all these actions and attacks, not just on Ripple, but on everyone else. And I guess there's something that's fading in our memories of the financial crisis. I read the SEC's concerns are all about whether this is the genesis of another crisis.
So the SEC has power over securities.
Hence the technical debate,
they have
which
power
is very important.
over securities. And I think what they're trying to do is claim jurisdiction over the crypto market, but the only way they can do that is to try to establish that crypto transactions are actually security transactions. So I think that's a very fundamental point. So when Ripple defends itself against the SEC or other important or major players in the industry are defending themselves against the SEC, it's not a disrespect to a regulator. It's simply saying your jurisdictional lines end here. It doesn't mean that consumers are not deserving of protection. It doesn't mean that the market is not deserving of, that it should operate with integrity that people can trust. It doesn't mean we don't need laws, rules, and regulations to keep bad actors out. It simply means that unless Congress has provided you, regulator, with authority, you can't extend your authority through regulation by enforcement beyond the line that has been drawn by statute, which is, for now, you only are there to supervise the securities market. And the crypto itself is not a security, and then depending on whether a crypto transaction is packaged as a security transaction, we'll take it from there. But I think what's also embedded in your question is, well, why is the SEC doing this? And I think the unfortunate answer is they're doing it because they're advancing politics and power over sound policy. Again, going back to this jurisdictional issue. They want to control the crypto market, and rather than do the hard work of working collaboratively with policymakers and their fellow regulators to develop those rules that we need, they're simply trying to, it's almost a land grab, but I think that land grab is failing. But again, whether crypto presents a systemic threat to the economy, that's something we can talk about. Whether crypto should be operated with a compliance-first mindset, I think we can all agree on that. Do consumers need protection from bad actors? Yes. Does the market need protection from manipulation? Yes. Should bad actors have to get over very high fortifications and walls before they can enter the DeFi system? Yes. But the answer to that is not which regulator controls. The answer to that is what is the right answer.
Excellent, very good. Let's open up the discussion and come back to this point of systemic risks and many other avenues of discussions that you put up. Let's just briefly, from my right, start with introducing, saying who you are, who you represent, and then we'll open up the conversation.
Elisabeth Noble, Senior Policy Expert, European Banking Authority.
Okay. Hi, I'm Iklak Sidhu. I'm the Dean of the School of Science and Technology at IE in Madrid. Okay, I'll stop there.
I'm Judith Arnal, and I'm here on behalf of the Center for European Policy Studies, which is a Brussels-based think tank.
Hi, my name is Morshad Mannan. I'm a research fellow here at the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute.
Excellent. So it's starting from the person that's closest to me might be easiest way to start. So we just had a really eloquent sort of picture of what's happening in the US. I wonder from where you sit in Paris and your perspective over the UK, Europe, can you give us a little bit of a flavor how you see the regulation landscape sort of evolving, sort of like a bigger map beyond just the US, and where you see the gaps for improvement?
Yeah, so of course within the European Union we now have the Markets in Crypto Assets regulation, which is intended to address a gap that we observed in the regulatory framework in the European context. So specifically, we recognize that some crypto assets could be financial instruments within the scope of MiFID, the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive. Some could be possibly traditional e-money, but tokenized, and potentially also some tokenized deposits in there. But essentially, we identified a gap where the majority of crypto assets would not be covered by pre-existing European legislation, and hence we now have this new piece, the Markets in Crypto Assets regulation, which then creates a holistic approach to the regulation of issuance activities, but also crypto asset service provisions such as operating trading platforms and exchanges. And I think with this we bring a lot of certainty. So I think Stu was really reflecting on the fact that for market players in the US, they didn't necessarily know what the rules might be in some instances. Here we're clarifying the framework to bring confidence and certainty so that those players who choose to issue crypto assets towards the European public or to offer crypto asset services, they will have this new framework, bespoke framework, which sets out very clear rules. And these are also rules that very much align with where international standard setters are. So we haven't yet touched on the fact that we do have European rules, but we also have international standards in this space in the context of the Financial Stability Board, in the context of IOSCO's recommendations, even last year in the context of crypto asset services and decentralized finance. And I think where we're getting to more broadly is an understanding that these activities can bring value. They can enhance efficiencies within the payments area. They can also support asset tokenization and potentially deepen markets for certain types of assets, which can complement, for instance, capital markets union initiatives. But to have that sort of catalyst, you really need the confidence effect, which is what we achieve through this new regulatory package.
Capital markets union meaning that the EU is more unified in the way that it tackles this area. And are you saying essentially that you're just bringing the rules from other more traditional assets to these digital riskier assets, or is there any difference in the way that we should handle this with more care, because we fear that this is more systemic and that this is where the next crisis is? What's the thinking behind?
Well, certainly the European approach is very much modelled on pre-existing European measures, where we could be inspired by measures to mitigate risk to consumers, to mitigate risks of money laundering, to enhance prudential resilience, and to also enhance essentially operational resilience in the area. So for us, we didn't have to reinvent the wheel, but there are some specific controls where we see the need for bespoke requirements that you perhaps don't see in some other pieces of legislation. And part of that is around how one presents information towards consumers, and part of that is around how one creates reserves of assets in the case of so-called stable coins to make sure that they do maintain true stability of value, and that consumers, if they choose to use them as an alternative means of payment, have an assurance that yes, there really is that stability of value that allows that unit to be confidently used as a means of exchange.
Should we be worried? I was reading about the bill in the US, and some worry that this will even create, the SEC specifically, that they would create new regulatory gaps on the oversight of these investments. How do you see the approach in Europe or in the US and UK? Are regulators doing what they should do for these sort of very risky systemic assets?
Yeah. So first I'll just say that I think what's been happening in the EU is very positive, that, like regulators are actually making, regulators can do one of two things. They can either make it possible for people to use new technologies, or they can put a lot of doubt and they can make people afraid to use those new technologies. And I think EU is actually making it possible. I'd say this is a place where there's been advancement as opposed to catching up. And, I'd say, I've seen this story evolving over a long period of time. Go back to 2014, 15. We were all talking about, oh, look, blockchain, digital currency. What are all the business models? What are all the things that you can do with it? And then everybody just got stuck. And why were they stuck? Not because the technology couldn't do it, but because the chief legal officer at every company would say, well, that's great, but we just can't take that risk. The regulation is unclear. What do you do? I think US took one approach, which basically didn't really help. EU and even the Middle East have been more progressive, kind of fixing that. I'd say if just broadening my point of view, maybe this would be my final point for now, would be that I think when it comes to regulation, first, regulators don't have a lot of incentive to say yes to something. They have a lot of incentive to say no, because anything
that's what they get up in the morning.
Yeah, exactly, right?
To ban things.
Well, I mean, to their credit, if they can be progressive, it really takes some guts to do it, and so I gotta applaud them for that. And the second thing here is, when it comes to technology, it seems that we repetitively are over-prescriptive in how we regulate. You know, I would say GDPR cannot possibly even be fulfilled with Gen AI. Like, it's impossible for ChatGPT to actually fully comply with GDPR. So GDPR is written very specifically with one view of technology in mind. You wait 2 more years, and all of that doesn't mean anything because the technology doesn't work that way.
Irrelevant.
So, yeah, so, you know, it's like if you're gonna write regulations based on like a set of bits or exactly an implementation, like, you just wait a year and that will be useless. So, you know, you really have to get back to what was the effect on people, what was the intention of the person, like what is the effect, not in the exact technical way that something was done. That would be my message here.
Excellent. Judith, what about you? Do you see the so-called Brussels effect on the way that the EU is regulating this space? Is it clumsy about it? Is it doing the right thing versus the US?
Well, I think that the EU has done the right thing. I think that the market in crypto assets regulation, MiCA, has brought legal certainty. But for this effect to last, we really need market players to see how this is going to be implemented, to be able to implement it before moving on to the temptation of MiCA 2.0. This is very important. So at FEPS, we argue in favor of some kind of a regulatory pause when it comes to financial services for the next institutional cycle. We know that there's like a big temptation for any commissioner in charge of financial services to have like their own brand new files on the table. But it's also important to let private sector, financial players, and even public authorities implement that regulation. So the step in the right direction has been taken. So now I think that the Brussels effect was very strong a few years ago. Maybe it's waning a bit. So it would be great, for instance, if EU institutions, especially the European Commission, could fight actively for this Brussels effect. So for other jurisdictions to really somehow take MiCA as an inspiration. Elisabeth was mentioning before FSB, IOSCO, at the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, there were common standards adopted regarding the prudential treatment of bank exposures to crypto assets. So that's the good way to go. Of course, since there are many loopholes, which for instance stem from reverse solicitation, it's good that we have global standards. And I think that the EU should focus on having these global standards by somehow exporting MiCA to the rest of the world.
Excellent. So, Morshad, how do you see this enforcement as Judith is talking about? Do you see the role of regulators to continue to enforce? Is there another way of doing things?
So as someone who is an academic and not a regulator, of course, I'll take a step back in terms of how I view this and sort of try to position a bit of this discussion in the scholarship. So there are 3, I think, criticisms that are made of MiCA, which in a way I'll be a bit provocative and pushing back in some of the positive assessment of MiCA. So one is that basically EU financial law is, so MiCA is more conservative and restrictive than EU financial law is in general. So if you look at MiFID II, the rules with respect to the origin of third country investment firms is more liberal than it is for MiCA, like investment firms who want to be involved as stablecoin issuers or as CASPs. So for example, one of the ways is that you have to create a subsidiary in the European Union. You have to, in the case of CASP, have to also have a European director as a way of enforcing this sort of global body to be able to be part of this EU regime and sort of being brought on shore. So there is one aspect about whether this whether we are sort of seeing a little bit of overreach. The other 2 criticisms that sometimes is, we're starting to see a little bit with something that is just, very new, is about the fact that there is no equivalence regime in the MiCA regulation right now. There is a discussion about there being one, which basically means that if, let's say, a third country, another part of the world, develops a regime that can have a legal effect that is similar to what is being developed in the European Union, right now that will not be recognized. unionized. You would have to comply with the EU regulations as well as that third country's regulations with respect to this. So that is another sort of maybe another constraint. And then the third aspect of this is about coordination globally. And this is an issue right now where under Article 107 of the MiCA regulation, you are able to have like authorities in the European Union coordinate with authorities outside of the EU with respect to compliance with the EU law, with respect to, let's say, compliance with MiCA regulations, but it's not reciprocal. The EU regulator is not obliged to coordinate with a third country with respect to enforcing their country's laws with respect to crypto assets and stable coins and so on. So I feel like, yes, it's great to have legal certainty. It's great that there is, you know, an alternative to regulation by enforcement, but I still think that there is much to be done in the years ahead with exporting the Brussels effect, for instance.
And let's talk about the more to be done in a little while. But Stu, I want to go back to you because Iklak was talking about chief legal officers and how they're, you know, just reining in companies. Is it so? Basically, is it your
Do you
job?
stop all progress in Ripple too?
No. Is it your job to see where the regulator's bar is and then just up it up 2 notches and like basically subdue the innovation and kill the company's growth? Is that what you do every day?
I hope not. I think the role of a chief legal officer is to identify the risk, identify the likelihood of the risk happening, and define the consequences of the risk.
When you say the risk, do you mean the regulators?
Right. Well, there is regulatory risk.
Mm-hmm.
There's financial risk.
Yeah.
There's reputational risk. So if if a company or the CEO or the board comes to me and says they want to do something, I could say, look, the risk is high, and the consequences of that risk, either from a financial standpoint, a regulatory standpoint, or a reputational standpoint, is also very high. Up to you whether you want to pursue it. Hopefully you're working with smart people, they come to the right conclusion. Sometimes the likelihood of the risk happening is low, and the consequence of the risk manifesting itself is low, so you may take a different route. So before I joined Ripple 5.5 years ago, I worked in traditional banking. I was general counsel for HSBC North America. I was managing counsel at American Express. And there, you're working sort of under the heavy, heavy hand of regulators. So the ability of traditional finance to pivot and to do new and different things is much harder. Because this, I agree, the status quo is ingrained, and a regulator has never been fired for doing what their predecessor did yesterday, right? Whereas in a privately held company like Ripple, even though we're a compliance-first company, there's a lot more freedom to do what we want to do. But here we're talking about marrying a DeFi technology, ultimately with a TradFi, traditional finance, and I think we have to find a way to bridge those two together. Again, protect consumers, protect the integrity of the market, keep bad actors out, but doing all of that without suffocating the innovation.
How do you strike that balance? It's extremely hard to do.
Well, I think my friend here was on the right track. You don't regulate the technology because you'll never understand the technology enough. The technology is going to develop much faster than you can write the laws, rules, or regulations. Before the ink is dry on your legislation, the technology is going to advance another generation or two. So you focus on activity, and you focus on conduct, and you focus on the risk of that activity and that conduct, and sort of same risk, same regulatory outcome. So it may be that you don't need new laws, rules, and regulations in every instance, and in some instances, it may be that you do. Because it could be that existing laws, rules, and regulation applied to new technology, that new technology simply can't operate. So you need to create new laws, rules, or regulations. But again, you need to understand the technology to understand the activity and the consequences of that activity, but don't regulate the technology. Just like in 1996 in the US, if we had regulated the internet with the same laws, rules, or regulations that we have for rotary telephones, we wouldn't have the internet as we know it today. So we recognize what is the aim that we were trying to get to. That the internet, they couldn't be regulated by, does a phone line go from one state to another state and then it stops and then you need a new license to take it to a new state. We recognize that that wouldn't work with the technology. So we created a framework where this new technology, the internet in 1996, could grow with some protections. Is that perfect? Looking back now, 30 plus years or 40 plus years, wherever we are. Did we get it perfect? Probably not. Do we need to adjust it? Maybe. But we wouldn't have computers in our pockets today if we had decided to regulate that industry as we did with telegraph machines or rotary telephones. And I think that's really where we are now today in this industry.
Excellent. So, Elisabeth, going back to the European Banking Authority, how worried should we be about any sort of gaps in the regulation, and where do you see? Just take us, 5 years from now. What's the landscape? What as a senior policy expert at the EIB, how are you seeing things? What's keeping you up at night in terms of regulating this space, or not? Maybe letting it, grow and innovation thrive.
Yeah, so in terms of where we are with MiCA, well, the first tranche of MiCA becomes applicable at the end of June this year. That relates to the issuance of asset reference tokens and e-money tokens, the so-called stable coins. So at the EBA, our top priority will be to see that regime enforced effectively in practice. So for the last 12 months or so, we've been working very carefully to develop the relevant technical standards and guidance to support that part of MiCA, but also very closely with national authorities to essentially improve that sort of skills and knowledge base to really support supervisory dialogue as we see authorities and industry move towards the application of that part of the regime. And I think this will become increasingly important from an enforcement perspective, whereas, of course, we want to see consistency in how member states apply this part of the regime in practice. Now, looking ahead, what I would like to see in the next 5 years is really, firstly, to see this regime being used in practice. So I would like to see that we have issuances of EMTs, ARTs in Europe. I would like to see these tokens being embedded to support more technology and innovation around payments, potentially to support asset tokenization in securities markets. And I think there is a lot of potential there for these tokens to be used as an alternative means of exchange to support the use of blockchain at a wider scale than we've seen it to date. But then when it comes to gaps, well, I think we'll know with experience. I would agree with Judith that for me, I wouldn't see, at least in the immediate priority, a need for a MiCA Mark II. But of course, the market never stays still. We need to be aware of arbitrage risk, but we also need to be aware of disintermediation evolutions. And I think we hear a lot about DeFi, decentralized finance. To date, we haven't seen a lot of that in the markets, but if we have a situation where there are fewer intermediaries involved, but you're still having economic functionalities performed increasingly outside that intermediated structure, we will need to look again at the ambit of regulation to think, are our rules and requirements sufficient? And if we are to tolerate decentralized finance at a larger scale, then how does the regulation potentially look? How will the supervisory techniques evolve? And what then does that mean in terms of the European regulatory and legislative landscape? But I think the immediate priority is enforcing what we've got, making sure we have that supervisory dialogue, and not just within the EU, but also with third country authorities. And as a very final point, I think, going to the earlier comment about reciprocity in terms of that supervisory dialogue, personally, I would see it working rather well with third country authorities. Even now, we see very many coming forward to ask questions about how does MiCA operate in practice, to start to build bridges in terms of supervisory dialogue around sharing information, around enforcement and so on. So actually I see a really strong appetite within the global regulatory and supervisory community to work together to enforce and apply evolving regulation.
Do you see the US regulators moving in that direction?
Well, our focus is largely on the sort of so-called stablecoin side, and we see a lot of progress around the New York Department for Financial Services. They already have a regime in place, and we have a pretty proactive dialogue with them already. So, of course, there are some wider debates and discussions in the US about how to address other parts of the crypto industry, including at a federal level. We're not really so much part of that. But I would say there is an appetite to ensure that technologies can be used responsibly, which means effective mitigation of risks, whilst not stamping out that potential opportunity to leverage the technologies to potentially enhance payment systems, payment services, and potentially securities markets.
Morshid, I see you nodding there for a few points. Let's have a quick reply from any quick thoughts on what Elisabeth is saying.
I mean, with the last point, I was just thinking that it's interesting to think a little bit about this broader conversation that happened earlier with respect to the fragmentation of internet governance and whether we're going to see the fragmentation of the governance of, for instance, stablecoins and crypto assets in the future.
What do you think? Do you think we will see a fragmentation?
So for instance, if we look at the policies that like China, for instance, has been developing in recent years, and then we look at what has been happening in the United States and then at the European Union, and then we look at other parts of the world where stable coins are being used, like different countries in Africa. I feel that right now there is still a state of fragmentation, but as mentioned, just even through the work that we see here at the EUI and the Florence School of Banking, we're starting to see dialogues that are happening, especially among European, of course, regulators, but also those who have a close relationship with it. But I think, there is still a lot of political debate about this, whether that is going to actually have a degree of harmonization in the future. Yeah.
Judith, from your perspective, how do you see the convergence of regulators, or not, maybe even deeper divergence and more gaps for more actors to exploit the loopholes?
I think that regulatory divergence is a real risk. This is, for instance, happening with artificial intelligence, where we see that there is increasing divergence. I don't see why it wouldn't happen with crypto assets. But I would like to pick on a point made by Stu earlier on the need to regulate the activity and the conduct and not the technology. And knowing how difficult the whole legislative process is in the EU, I would argue in favor of a principles-based level 1 legislation, like having the broad principles that are not going to change or that are going to be adapted a bit more to an evolving reality.
What should be a core principle when we think about this very risky, unstable technology?
For instance, I think that having like a clear taxonomy and the main principles for consumer protection makes sense.
A ranking of the risk.
Yeah, but then I think that it's for the EBA, for the ESAs, for the European supervisory authorities to develop this with level 2 legislation, because level 2 can, it's not that I want to put a lot of work on your plate, but I think that can change more easily. And I'm thinking, for instance, and there was a very clear example about this in the EU with the AI regulation.
Can you quickly explain to people what level 2 means?
Basically, the difference is level 1 is there's a proposal by the Commission, and then the European Parliament and the Council of the EU come to their respective positions, and then they come together and they come to an agreement, and then there's a regulation or a directive that has been passed. In that level 1 legislation, you have references to, for instance, the ESAs further developing the details of some of those pieces. So I think that if we fall in the temptation of having a lot of details at level 1, then you need to change that. You need to go through a whole interinstitutional process, which is very burdensome. So I think it makes sense to make this principles-based, because it's going to be longer lasting. And I was making reference to the AI regulation, for instance, because the Council, they came to their own position, and suddenly, just a few weeks afterwards, Gen AI exploded. So their position was completely outdated.
And they had to go back to the drawing board and change it again.
that's it. So I'm very worried about that happening, especially because if
You're
the EU...
worried about a ChatGPT moment in
I'm
blockchain.
worried about a ChatGPT moment with very detailed level 1 legislation. So I think that this is a principle that should be applied to anything related to technology, to any legislation dealing with technology.
And I know that we have a lot of things that we want to convey, but we have time now for Q&A. Let's see, open up to questions, hopefully from humans and not machines. Can you say quickly who you are and keep the question very, very short?
Okay, I can promise only on the first one. So my name is Vanessa Villanueva. I'm Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute. Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation today, and thank you to Stu for this morning conversation with the working group. So turning to the Brussels effect, I think that the Brussels effect established only whether the EU has jurisdiction, but has been very deficient in terms of enforcement, something that instead in the US has been much more efficient through the extensive power of the SEC, which eventually led Ripple to very complicated litigation that lasted several years, but ended up well for Ripple because now we have this type of new test or new possibilities for crypto enterprises to enter this market, and having only a direct relationship, not with retail investors, but with only institutional investors. So my question is, now that we have, I think that this is very good for crypto, very bad for the SEC, but isn't it bad for crypto in the long run, provided that there is not alternative regulation at this point? And this question points to the fact that the market needs information. If we keep only companies private, and this might not be the case for Ripple because, as you mentioned, you have like audited financial statements, but I think in the world of crypto, so other crypto enterprises that remain private and that only have a direct dialogue with institutional investors, is limiting the information that is going into the markets, and eventually the market is missing that information. So we have a loss of information. So what are your takes on that? Thank you.
Eklik, you want to take that?
Yeah, okay, all right. Honestly, it's a really lot of stuff to talk about there. I feel like there's a number of things that have been brought up, like the efficiency of like the system, whether a precedent was set. There's the whole global, regulation across countries. Like, there's a lot that's going on here. I think I could maybe try to answer all of it with an idea here.
You're better than ChatGPT, I can see that.
Well, wait till you see the answer, then you might disagree. But I feel like we've kind of lived through some of this before. Stu was saying when the internet was developed, how do we choose to regulate and so forth? I feel like I was one of those people who was working on that, like I'm old enough to say that. And, I'd say for 10 years, I was like every day thinking nothing more than how do you get a set of bits from here to there? I mean, I'm like, that's how boring I was, then. And, but that's what I worked on. And you'd be amazed how complicated that problem of getting a few bits from here to there are, and all these rules, and whether, and there's a centralization question there, there's policy questions there. There's a lot that happened there, and I never thought at that time that those few bits would actually represent money. Like at that time, it was just bits because they were a message. What happened, a few years later is like, oh, guess what? Those bits can be money. But all those things that we figured out while we were doing the internet, those issues are resurfacing one more time. So when you get to cross-border, guess what? The internet is across the world, but the rules in every country are different. Some countries block the internet, some countries don't. Some people are very open. Do you think that that's going to go away or change? No. We're going to have that situation. And precedent, U.S. could have banned the internet. It could have been that way, and then every state and everyone could have had a lawsuit, and eventually, I don't think that would have been the good approach. I think the EU approach of let's at least make something work would be the better approach. And if I can introduce what I think is really the next opportunity here is AI is about to change all of this. So, we've been getting something to work on moving money around, and now, what will happen with misinformation, what will happen with AI, but I think AI might actually be part of us solving how do you know what the regulation there is, could you guess that you're allowed to send these bits there or not. I think there's a lot to figure out on the AI side just above kind of getting the rules in place right now.
Motion.
So I want to touch up, in answering, I also want to touch upon a point that Stu mentioned, and well, now it's been mentioned by several people. It's a bit about the, how do we approach this future question about something like decentralized exchanges, automated market makers, and other, let's say, aspects of this decentralized finance, even beyond decentralized finance, that we're now seeing emerge. I think AI and automation is going to drive this even further, which is looking at something that came up with Lawrence Lessig and working on early work on the internet and the law, which is he identified that there are four modalities that work on the person. There is the law, the market, the architecture, and social norms. A lot of what we focused on so far is using the law to try to affect markets, using the law even to try to shape architecture in some ways. There's even been these discussions about killing smart contracts and these sorts of things. A kill switch for smart contracts. But one thing that I feel will become increasingly important is using law to shape social norms. And we see this a little bit with respect to another sort of big elephant in the room, which is the energy consumption of blockchain protocols, which aside from the consumer risk, the energy aspect has come about. But how did Ethereum go from being proof of work to proof of stake? It wasn't just because of states saying you are, or newspapers like the Financial Times or the Guardian reporting that you are consuming electricity like a country. It's because of social norms changing that led to when there was an upgrade, they all agreed voluntarily to change from proof of work to proof of stake. And this was partly because of a shift in social norms. And I think this is going to be really important when we start dealing with global distributed technologies going forward.
It doesn't matter who answers that question. I just want to say, add that to all the GPUs that are also going to be taking energy. And both of these trends are straight up.
Very, very interesting. Okay, looks like we have another question. Can you just briefly say who you are in a short question?
Sure. My name is Leopoldo. I am a research associate at the Florida School of Banking and Finance. And a lot has been said about this idea of regulating the activity, not the technology, that being the blockchain, of course. And I will agree in principle, but the only way in which lawyers think about new stuff happening is by comparison with other criteria that we had. In the US case was the Howey test, meaning an investment with the expectation of a profit based on the effort of a third person. In the case of companies, I would like to hear, how this particular asset differs from this criteria, because it has been there for a reason. Now, I'm sympathetic to the technology. I'm Argentinian, so I tend to believe that, financial systems did not work for me, and I see the effort as, something good to preserve, but I don't know. So far, my policy vision is that it's best to invest in creating public infrastructures of a stable financial system rather than relying in a technology that will take us out of the system and not work on the basics. Conversely, the regulators addressing specific risks is also important. Instability has been mentioned, but retail risk is also being a huge thing to consider. So, yes, I would like to hear more about that. Like, why is this useful and not? Maybe one day we build something cool. I want to know, how that cool thing is going to look like, what risk does it entail, and how we address them.
Stu, sounds like a question for you.
So a couple of things. Number one, Not regulating the technology doesn't mean that you don't need an understanding of the technology before you regulate. And I think that's an important nuance. And I also agree that principle-based regulations are important. We could talk about the Howey test, but I'll probably bore everybody to tears, but that's all, I've been thinking about the Howey test and probably nothing else for the past 5 years. But I think the Howey test, when applied to digital assets faithfully, can work. So is there an investment in a common enterprise? Is there an investment in Apple? Or am I simply buying a digital asset and it's not an investment in anything else other than owning that digital asset, and I may be speculating in that or may be using that. But I think fundamentally what you're asking is, I want protections. I want protections as a consumer. I want protections for the market. I want protections for a bad actor. That goes back to principle-based regulations. FTX, and the reason Sam Bankman-Fried is sitting in prison right now, is not because he violated the securities law. It's because he committed fraud. It had nothing to do with whether the assets he was trading were securities or commodities. He committed fraud. And because in the US we were having this argument about whether something should be a security or commodity and who should watch FTX or who should supervise them, all this silly kind of regulatory political fight was going on, this fraud was happening. So if you had basic principle-based regulation that said fraud is bad no matter the market, we could have caught it. CZ is going to be going to prison, not because he violated the securities laws, but because they had lapses in anti-money laundering controls on their platform. That's an important principle that I think we can all agree on, how it applies to DeFi and how it applies to a pseudo-anonymous platform that gets a little bit more complicated. But again, whether or not they were trading securities or commodities or virtual currencies or something else, doesn't matter. That you have to apply with fundamental rules against financial money laundering, anti-money laundering, sanctions, things like that. So again, I think to your point, if you pull back to those large principles, that's what we should be focusing on, and not which regulatory agency gets to claim control, because I think we keep our eye off the ball, and that's how all of these other bad actors were able to do what they were able to do. And I'll just take another 10 seconds. Also, back to FTX, it became a race to the bottom, and I think if you create regulatory structures in responsible jurisdictions, and then companies like Ripple are gravitating to those responsible jurisdictions and subjecting themselves to licensing regimes, that creates trust. And I think what we saw with FTX was a race to a bottom to go to jurisdictions, and again, this is not a slight on where they ultimately landed that jurisdiction, but light touch jurisdictions is not the answer. So if you don't need exact harmony with international regulatory regimes, but at least you know that consistently if a company is doing business there, me as a consumer, as an investor, as a developer, I can trust that a regulator is going to be acting to keep that player a responsible player with a compliance-first mindset.
Excellent. And I think on that note, that I'm afraid that's all the time that we have today. Thank you so much. I hope that you take to your weekends something interesting from this discussion. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Excellent, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Great.
Thank you. That was very nice.
Yeah.